The January wind howled across Cinder Bluff like the breath of some ancient fury driving snow through every crack and crevice of the raw lumber town. The year was 1870, and winter had settled over the Great Plains territories with the merciless grip of a predator, seeking to crush all life beneath its frozen weight. Buildings huddled together for warmth, their yellow windows casting weak pools of light onto streets turned treacherous with ice and mud. Clara Jameson knelt in the frozen muck, her worn calico dress clinging to her 20-year-old frame like a burial shroud. 6 months of wandering had carved the softness from her face, leaving behind sharp cheekbones and eyes that held the wariness of hunted animals. Beside her, 17-year-old Lena pressed close, her blue eyes enormous above hollow cheeks. The girl's curiosity, once her defining trait, had been tempered by hunger and fear into something more cautious and calculating. "We didn't steal nothing." Clara said, her voice steady despite the Colt Navy pointed at her chest. "We got no quarrel with Mr. Kingsley or his business." Scarface Sam spat a stream of tobacco juice that steamed in the cold air like blood on snow. The hired gun's weathered face bore the puckered scar that ran from temple to jaw, a memento from a knife fight in Abilene that had left 3 men dead, and Sam with a reputation that opened doors and closed mouths throughout the territory. His pale eyes assessed the sisters like a butcher examining livestock, calculating their value in terms of pain and profit. "Your daddy had something that belongs to Mr. Kingsley." Sam drawled his voice, carrying the flat menace of a man who had killed before and would again without losing sleep. "Time you girls handed it over along with whatever else he might have told you." Behind him, 3 more gunmen sat their horses with professional alertness. Their mounts snorted and stamped vapor rising from their nostrils in ghostly plumes that dissipated in the cutting wind. Along the street, every window glowed with lamplight, but not a single face appeared. In Reginald Kingsley's domain, survival meant blindness and deafness when his enforcers rode to collect debts. Sam reached for Lena's wrist with calloused fingers that had throttled the life from 2 claim jumpers just the previous month. "Come along, girl. Mr. Kingsley's waiting in his office, and he ain't known for his patience with folks who keep him waiting." The rifle shot cracked across the frozen air like breaking timber, echoing off the false-fronted buildings and startling roosting ravens from their perches. Sam's horse shrieked and toppled sideways, its neck fountaining crimson onto the pristine snow. The gunman rolled clear with surprising agility for a man of his bulk, cursing as he fought to clear his weapon from its holster, while his dying mount thrashed in its death agonies. From the shadows between buildings, a tall figure emerged with the fluid grace of a hunting wolf. Akacheta moved through the swirling snow like something born to it, his buckskin clothing dark with moisture eagle feathers ice-crusted in his black hair that hung loose past his shoulders. The Spencer carbine in his hands was already being reloaded with movements so practiced they seemed unconscious muscle memory forged in countless battles against soldiers and settlers alike. 30 winters had weathered the Lakota warrior's face into planes and angles that spoke of endurance and controlled violence. The scar along his jaw, earned in last year's railroad fight, where he had lost 3 brothers to cavalry sabers, was pale against his copper skin. But it was his eyes that marked him as dangerous, dark, and steady, with the patience of a man who had killed before and would again without hesitation if honor demanded it. "You got people?" His question cut through the wind, directed at Clara with quiet intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and reach straight to truth. She met his gaze without flinching, recognizing something in his manner that offered hope where none had existed moments before. "No. Nobody left who cares whether we live or die." The warrior nodded toward the narrow passage between Morrison's general store and Hutchins' blacksmith shop. "Then both of you come home with me. This debt I owe, and tonight I pay it in full." Sam's Colt cleared leather with professional speed, the worn grip fitting his hand, like it had been crafted specifically for his fingers. "You red bastard, you just signed your death warrant and theirs too." But Akasheta was already moving his Spencer, speaking again as he herded the sisters toward shelter. The bullet took one of Sam's men high in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a scream that cut through the wind like a blade. Wood exploded from the storefront beside Clara's head as return fire erupted, sending splinters flying like wooden shrapnel that stung her cheek and drew thin lines of blood. "Run!" Akasheta commanded, backing toward the alley with his rifle held ready. "Livery stable behind Morrison's store. Follow the back passages and don't stop until you reach it." They fled through the maze of rear entrances and loading docks that connected Cinder Bluff's scattered businesses, their boots slipping on patches of ice and refuse that had accumulated over the harsh winter months. The wind carried the sounds of pursuit shouts and gunfire, and the thunder of hooves on frozen ground as more of Kingsley's men joined the hunt. Clara's lungs burned with each breath of the Arctic air, but she forced herself to match the warrior's ground-eating pace while keeping one hand firmly gripped on Lena's wrist. The livery stable rose before them like a wooden fortress, its weathered walls promising sanctuary from the storm and the bullets. Akasheta shouldered open the back door, ushering them into warmth that smelled of hay and horse sweat and leather oil. For the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to believe they might survive until dawn. Inside the straw-filled dimness, she packed their meager possessions with mechanical efficiency, born of long practice. 2 hardtack biscuits wrapped in oilcloth, a striker and steel for making fire, a bone sewing needle, the small folding knife that had belonged to their father. Everything they owned in the world fit into a single flour sack that had once held grain for Morrison's chickens. Lena huddled beside the stable owner's brazier, holding her hands over flames that danced like imprisoned spirits, desperate for freedom. Her fingers were bone white with cold, the nails tinged blue despite the shelter and warmth. As feelings slowly returned to her extremities, she absently picked frost-stiffened porcupine quills from Akasheta's sleeve, her natural curiosity overriding the fear that had dominated her thoughts for weeks. "Much obliged for what you done?" She whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the building's frame like bones in a burial shroud. The warrior acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod, but kept his attention focused on the stable's front entrance, where the yellow light from the street lamps created shifting patterns on the dirty glass. His Spencer lay across his knees, and brass cartridges glinted dully within easy reach of his right hand. Every few minutes, he would rise and peer through gaps in the weathered boards, checking for movement in the storm-lashed street, where Sam's remaining men were undoubtedly planning their next assault. "How long you been in this town?" he asked without turning from his vigil. "Month, maybe more." Clara replied, though the answer was imprecise, because time had become fluid since their parents' deaths. Since the deep cold set in, and the roads became impassable. The wagon crash at Prairie Rose Crossing had shattered more than wood and bone. It had destroyed the last remnants of their ordered world, and left them adrift in a territory that showed no mercy to the helpless or unprotected. The spring floods had undermined the makeshift bridge that settlers had built to cross the seasonal torrent, and the entire structure had collapsed just as their father guided the heavily loaded wagon across. Both parents had been crushed beneath falling timbers, their bodies broken beyond recognition, while their daughters watched helplessly from the riverbank. The months that followed had been a blur of desperate wandering from settlement to settlement. They had slept in haylofts and abandoned cabins, scrubbed floors at the Rusty Nail Saloon for crusts of bread and thin soup that barely kept them alive. Clara had sold her mother's wedding ring to a freight driver, only to be abandoned when winter weather made the roads too dangerous for travel. Worst of all had been Scarface Sam's persistent attention. The gunman worked for Reginald Kingsley, who owned the Quicksilver Mercury mine that had been carved into the mountainside above Raven Rock, like a wound in the earth itself. Sam had been asking questions about their father, who had briefly worked as a surveyor for Kingsley's mining operation the previous spring. There was something the mine owner wanted desperately, something he believed the sisters possessed or knew about. A soft knock interrupted Clara's grim memories, the sound barely audible above the wind, but distinct enough to make Acacheta tense like a coiled spring. He motioned for silence before calling out in barely audible tones, "State your business and speak quick about it." "Dr. Walter, got medicine for the young ones and news that can't wait." The warrior eased the door open just wide enough to reveal a thin, elderly man whose wire-rimmed spectacles reflected the brazier's glow like tiny mirrors. Dr. Cornelius Walter had ministered to the territory's scattered settlements for 2 decades, riding between homesteads with nothing but a sway-backed mare and an inexhaustible supply of compassion that had earned him respect from whites and Indians alike. "Let me tend those hands," he said to Lena, producing a small tin of wool-fat salve from his black medical bag. "Frostbites killed more folks out here than bullets ever did, and prevention's worth more than all the doctoring in the world." As he worked massaging the greasy ointment into her fingers with practiced gentleness, he slipped a wrapped biscuit into her lap. The gesture was performed without fanfare, the sort of quiet kindness that kept frontier communities alive during the harsh winter months when charity could mean the difference between survival and death. "Abigail Thornton's got a place ready for you," he told Clara in low tones. "The schoolteacher over at Sable Junction. Safe haven if you can reach it without getting yourselves killed in the process." Before she could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway, like a ghost materializing from the storm. Hugh Morrison bore the weathered features of a man who had spent 40 years wresting sustenance from reluctant soil, his face deeply lined from squinting into too many prairie sunrises. The drought had destroyed his wheat crop the previous summer, leaving him with nothing but mounting debts and the stubborn determination to keep fighting. "Brought my best mule," he said simply, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. "Nothing fancy to look at, but she'll carry you through weather that would kill a cavalry horse. Keep her long as needed. I got no use for her till spring planting anyway." "Can't pay you," Clara began, but the farmer waved away her protest with a dismissive gesture. "Your ma sat up 3 nights straight with my Sarah when the consumption took hold," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brewed willow bark tea every hour and fought that fever till it finally broke. Never asked for a cent or expected any thanks." His weathered face grew grave as he continued. "Besides, heard tell there's more at stake here than just water rights and mining claims. Kingsley's been buying up mineral rights all through the territory using papers that don't smell right to anyone with sense." Acacheta's head came up sharply, his dark eyes focusing on the farmer with sudden intensity. "What manner of papers do you speak of?" "Treaty lands mostly. Sacred ground burial sites, places that ain't supposed to be for sale at any price according to federal law." The Lakota warrior's expression darkened with barely controlled anger that made the temperature in the stable seem to drop several degrees. Such desecration was beyond mere greed. It was an assault on everything his people held sacred, a violation that demanded blood payment, according to the old ways. A low whistle from outside cut through their conversation like a blade, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably purposeful. Acacheta moved to the front of the stable with cat-like grace, recognizing the signal that meant danger was approaching. "Tokala," he announced, his voice carrying a note of relief. The back door admitted a Lakota youth whose 14 winters showed in the eager light of his dark eyes and the way he carried himself with the coiled energy of youth. Tokala was Acacheta's nephew, burning to prove himself as a warrior. but still learning the skills that would keep him alive in a world grown increasingly hostile to his people. 6 riders circled the town like wolves around a wounded buffalo. He reported in rapid Lakota before switching to English for the benefit of the others. The scarred one leads them, and their anger burns hot as forge fire. They search every building, and each empty room makes them more dangerous. Akacheta absorbed this information without visible emotion, though Clara saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Sam's wounded pride would make him more vicious than ever, and Kingsley's gold ensured his men's loyalty even in the face of death. Failure would mean more than unemployment. It would mean a shallow grave in the frozen ground where the ravens would pick their bones clean. "Can't stay here much longer," the warrior said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had survived too many battles to indulge in false hope. "They'll tear this place apart board by board before dawn if they have to." Dr. Walter repacked his supplies with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands moving with the speed that came from decades of emergency medicine on the frontier. Old boarding house on Elm Street's been empty since the cholera scare last summer. Yellow Death took 17 souls before it burned itself out, and folks still won't go near the place. Might give you a few hours rest if you're desperate enough to risk it. Clara shouldered their flour sack, her movements deliberate, despite the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders like lead blankets. Whatever secret their father had uncovered, whatever evidence Kingsley sought so desperately, it was clear that remaining in Cinder Bluff meant certain death before morning came. "Ready?" Akacheta asked, checking his rifle one final time while Tokala slipped back into the storm to scout their route. Clara studied her sister's frightened face, seeing trust beneath the fear that had become their constant companion. They had survived 6 months of hardship by depending on each other, sharing warmth and hope when both were in short supply. Now they would have to extend that trust to include the warrior who had risked everything for strangers. "Ready as we'll ever be," she confirmed, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The abandoned boarding house crouched in the darkness, like a monument to broken dreams, its boarded windows blind to the storm's fury that continued to lash the settlement with unrelenting force. The cholera outbreak that had swept through Cinder Bluff the previous summer had claimed 17 lives in as many days, leaving the 3-story building tainted with memories of suffering and death that kept even the desperate away. Akacheta led them through the rear entrance, his moccasined feet silent on snow-covered boards that creaked ominously under their combined weight. Inside, the air hung thick with abandonment dust and rodent droppings, and the lingering odor of carbolic acid from futile attempts to halt the Yellow Death's advance through the territory. Clara guided Lena to a corner where previous travelers had left moth-eaten blankets that smelled of mildew and fear. The girl settled onto the makeshift bedding, her slight frame racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold that seeped through every crack in the building's failing defenses against winter's assault. "Oh, should build a fire to warm ourselves," Clara murmured, already gathering scraps of wood that had been left by other desperate souls who had sheltered here. Akacheta shook his head with finality. "Smoke draws hunters like blood draws wolves. Cold won't kill us before morning, but bullets will end everything in heartbeats." They huddled together for warmth while the wind shrieked around the building's frame, like the voices of the dead demanding justice. Outside, the storm showed no sign of weakening, and somewhere in that howling darkness, armed men searched for their trail with the patience of professional killers who understood that their prey would eventually make a mistake. It was then that Clara made her choice, the decision that would change everything that followed. Reaching beneath her dress with fingers that trembled slightly, she found the hidden pocket their mother had sewn into the lining 6 months earlier. Her fingers closed around the small package that had remained concealed through all their wanderings, protected by oilcloth and desperate hope. "Lena," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Help me with this." It's time you knew what Papa died trying to protect. Working together by the faint light that filtered through broken shutters, the sisters peeled away layers of waterproof covering to reveal a single sheet of paper covered with their father's precise handwriting. The page had been torn from a surveyor's ledger, and it contained detailed measurements and locations that told a story of systematic theft on a scale that defied imagination. The illegal water diversions were mapped with mathematical precision channels and ditches that stole precious water from White River and Willow Gap, redirecting it to feed Kingsley's stamp mills, while downstream ranchers and farmers watched their wells run dry and their livestock die of thirst. Each theft was carefully documented with dates and flow measurements, creating an irrefutable record of crimes that violated both territorial and federal law. At the bottom of the page, their father had written in his careful script, R. Kingsley, systematic theft of territorial waters, evidence sufficient for federal prosecution and criminal charges of the highest order. Sweet Mother of Mercy. Clara breathed understanding, flooding through her like ice water. This is what they want. This is why Papa had to die. Acacheta studied the document by the pale light, his knowledge of English writing limited, but sufficient to read Creek names and recognize the devastating significance of the carefully drawn channels. More troubling were marginal notations that referenced treaty lands and mineral survey, in ways that suggested Kingsley's ambitions extended far beyond simple water theft into realms that threatened the very foundations of federal law. Your father made this map, he asked, his voice carrying new respect for a man he had never met, but now understood as a fellow warrior in the fight against injustice. Clara nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she remembered the careful way their father had worked by lamplight, checking and rechecking his measurements until they achieved the precision that might someday serve justice. He was hauling supplies to the mine last spring when he stumbled across the first illegal ditch. Said it didn't look right, didn't match any of the authorized water rights he'd surveyed before. The truth struck her with sickening clarity that made her stomach clench with rage and grief. Their parents' death had been no accident caused by spring floods and poor construction. Someone had sabotaged the Prairie Rose Bridge with deliberate calculation, knowing the heavily loaded wagon would collapse the weakened structure and eliminate the surveyor who had learned too much about Reginald Kingsley's crimes. Murder premeditated and cold-blooded, committed to silence, a man whose only crime had been dedication to truth and justice. Federal land agents coming to Iron Ridge. Lena said suddenly, her young voice cutting through Clara's dark thoughts. Heard the storekeeper talking about it with his wife. Due to arrive in 5 days to investigate water disputes that have been reported by downstream users. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as hope kindled in her chest like a struck match. The paper in her hands represented more than evidence. It was justice waiting to be served, retribution. For crimes that had destroyed innocent lives and corrupted the very foundations of territorial law. If they could reach the federal agent before Kingsley's corruption spread to him as well, the mine owner's empire would crumble like a house built on sand. But first, they had to survive the night and the manhunt that would follow. Boot steps on the front porch shattered the night's fragile peace like hammer blows against glass. Through gaps in the boarded windows, they could see lantern light dancing like hellfire. And Sam's voice carried clearly through the storm with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Check every room, every closet, every hole where a mouse might hide. He commanded his surviving men. Tear this place apart board by board if you have to. They're here somewhere, and Mr. Kingsley wants that paper before dawn breaks. Acacheta was already moving with the fluid grace of a predator, shepherding the sisters toward the building's rear, while his mind calculated angles and distances with the precision of a man who had survived countless battles. Behind them, The front door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood that echoed through the abandoned building like thunder, and yellow light flooded the dusty parlor where they had been hiding moments before. "Spread out and be thorough," Sam ordered, his scarred face twisted with fury and determination. "Mr. Kingsley wants those girls breathing, but their red friend's another matter entirely. Shoot him on sight and don't waste time with warnings." They squeezed through a broken window into the alley behind the boarding house, landing in snow that reached their knees, and immediately began soaking through their inadequate clothing with liquid cold that cut to the bone. The Arctic air struck like a physical blow, driving breath from lungs and setting every nerve ending ablaze with pain that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. But they were alive, and they carried evidence that could topple an empire built on corruption and murder. Now they simply had to stay alive long enough to deliver justice to those who had earned it through suffering and loss. "Iron Ridge," Clara whispered, clutching the precious document against her chest like a talisman. 70 miles through hell itself, if that's what it takes. Akacheta nodded, his warrior's mind already calculating routes and dangers with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. The territorial capital lay across some of the most unforgiving country in the territories, where winter could kill the unprepared and armed pursuit would follow their every step with relentless determination. "Together," he said simply, and the single word carried the weight of an oath sworn before gods and spirits that demanded fulfillment regardless of cost. Behind them, enraged shouts erupted as Sam's men discovered their escape route and realized their quarry had slipped away once again. The manhunt would resume with dawn, but for now, they had purchased a few precious hours of freedom with courage and desperation. The race for justice had begun in earnest. They fled Cinder Bluff in the hour before dawn, when the storm's fury had gentled to steady snowfall, and their pursuers had temporarily abandoned the night search in favor of rest and planning. Hugh Morrison's mule proved every bit as hardy as promised, accustomed to the brutal demands of frontier life, and capable of carrying 2 riders through conditions that would kill lesser animals. Clara and Lena rode double, while Akacheta jogged alongside with the tireless rhythm of his ancestors, his long legs covering ground at a pace that seemed impossible to maintain, but never faltered. The mule's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air, and her hooves crunched through the snow with steady determination that inspired confidence in her human companions. The trail to Iron Ridge wound through desolate country that tested the souls of even seasoned travelers who had crossed the plains many times before. Rolling grassland stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by creek beds, lined with leafless cottonwoods and stands of stunted pine that offered minimal shelter from the endless wind. In summer, the journey was merely arduous and uncomfortable. In winter, it became a trial that claimed the lives of the unwary and unprepared with ruthless efficiency. They had covered perhaps 12 miles when Tokala materialized from the swirling snow, like a spirit given form, his youthful face grave with the weight of bad news. The young warrior had been shadowing their back trail with the patience of a hunter, and his report sent ice through Clara's veins that had nothing to do with the weather. 7 riders now, he said in rapid Lakota, before switching to English for the sisters' benefit. The cruel one with the wire scars leads them, and their horses are grain-fed and strong. They follow our tracks like hounds following blood, and the distance between us grows shorter with each passing hour. Akacheta absorbed this information without visible emotion, though Clara saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Barbed wire Bill Hutchins had joined the hunt, bringing fresh men and animals to replace those lost in the previous night's fighting. The foreman's reputation for creative violence was legendary throughout the territory, and his methods had earned him a nickname that made strong men cross themselves and look over their shoulders. "How far behind us?" Akacheta asked, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had faced death so many times that it held no particular terror. "Perhaps 2 miles when I last saw them. Maybe less now that full daylight has come." The gap was closing too quickly for comfort or hope. Their mule, sturdy though she proved to be, could not match the sustained pace of grain-fed cavalry mounts, bred for endurance and speed. A man on foot was at a fundamental disadvantage regardless of his conditioning and wilderness skills, and their pursuers had the additional advantage of knowing exactly where their quarry was headed. They needed an equalizer, something to slow their pursuit or eliminate it entirely before superior numbers and better horses could be brought to bear. The Ash River provided their first real opportunity for tactical advantage. Normally, a modest stream that could be forded without difficulty springs snowmelt, and the recent storms had transformed it into a brown torrent that carved a treacherous channel through the prairie, with the power to sweep away horses and riders alike. The only safe crossing for 20 miles in either direction was an ancient rope ferry that swayed in the vicious current, like a drunken man trying to maintain his balance. The ferry consisted of rough planking lashed to pine logs with rawhide that had been waterproofed with pine tar, and the entire platform connected to the far bank by a hemp rope thick as a man's wrist and strong enough to bear considerable weight. Travelers could haul themselves across by pulling hand over hand, but the current ran fast and cold enough to kill anyone who lost their grip and fell into the churning water. "Can you swim if it comes to that?" Akacheta asked Clara as they approached the crossing, his dark eyes assessing the river's deadly power with the respect it demanded. "Some," she replied, though her voice betrayed doubt and fear. The river looked utterly murderous, its surface churning with debris and foam that spoke of rocks and fallen trees lurking beneath the dark water. Lena shook her head with brutal honesty. "Never learned proper. Papa always said he'd teach me when we settled somewhere permanent, but..." The sentence trailed off into the wind, carrying with it all the dreams that had died with their parents on a bridge that should have been strong enough to bear their weight. The warrior studied the rushing water with a tactician's eye, noting the way ice had made the rope treacherous, and spray from the rapids had turned the ferry platform into something that resembled a skating rink more than a safe crossing. One mistake, one moment of inattention or bad luck would send them all to watery graves that would never be found. All three together, he decided after long consideration. Move slow and careful. Stay low to keep our center of gravity stable, hold tight no matter what happens. They coaxed the reluctant mule onto the platform, her hooves slipping on the icy planking, until Clara managed to spread some of their grain sack beneath her feet for better traction. Then Akacheta began the crossing, hauling on the rope with steady rhythm, while the current fought every foot of progress with the malevolent intelligence of a living enemy. The icy hemp burned his palms through buckskin gloves that had been soaked and frozen until they offered little protection against the rough fibers. His shoulders screamed with the effort of fighting the river's relentless strength, and his breath came in sharp puffs that turned to frost on his lips and eyebrows within seconds of being exhaled. Clara watched his face as he worked, seeing the strain etched in lines around his dark eyes, the way perspiration mixed with melting ice on his forehead despite the brutal cold. Something twisted in her chest, not just gratitude for his sacrifice, but something deeper and more dangerous that she barely dared to acknowledge, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. They were halfway across the murderous torrent when riders appeared on the bank behind them, like harbingers of death and violence. Barbed wire. Bill sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born in the saddle, his cruel face set in lines of grim satisfaction beneath the brim of a hat that had seen too many gunfights and range wars. The 4 men flanking him were cut from the same cloth, hard-bitten gunmen who killed for pay and took professional pride in their ability to inflict creative suffering on those who crossed their employers. Bill raised his hand in a theatrical gesture, and rifles swung to bear on the helpless ferry with mechanical precision. The threat was clear and immediate. They were trapped in the middle of the river with nowhere to run and no cover to shield them from what was coming. End of the line. He called across the water, his voice carrying easily despite the wind and the sound of rushing current. Bring that platform back to this side, and we'll make this quick and relatively painless for the ladies. A rifle cracked with the sound of breaking timber, and the bullet struck the ferry rope inches from Akacheda's hands. Hemp fibers exploded like tiny fireworks, and the warrior felt the line shudder under the impact, while his mind calculated how many more shots the rope could absorb before parting entirely and sending them all to their deaths. Another shot followed, immediately splintering one of the platform's guide poles and reducing their already limited steering control to almost nothing. They were now at the mercy of the current as much as the gunmen who held their lives in their hands. Next one takes the older girl's head clean off her shoulders. Bill shouted with obvious relish. Your choice, Redskin. Bring them back alive or watch them die slow in that freezing water. Akacheda's response was to pull harder on the rope muscles bulging with effort as he fought the river's relentless current, while bullets whined past his head like angry hornets. Clara grabbed the remaining pole and added her strength to his, her face set with determination that would have made her father proud. I won't let them take us, she said through gritted teeth, her voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water and distant gunfire. Whatever happens, I won't let them drag us back to face Kingsley's justice. They were 3/4 across when catastrophe struck with the suddenness of lightning. A third rifle shot parted several strands of the rope, and the sudden shift in tension sent the platform spinning sideways into the current like a leaf caught in a whirlpool. Lena screamed as she slipped on the icy boards, her hands clawing desperately for purchase, as she slid toward the foaming water that would claim her life within seconds of contact. Akacheta didn't hesitate or weigh the consequences. He dove after her, his body cutting through the air like an arrow, before disappearing beneath the surface of the river with barely a splash. The water was liquid ice that drove into his bones like 1,000 daggers, each one sharper and more painful than the last. The current was a living thing that tumbled him downstream with malevolent purpose, battering him against submerged rocks, while he fought to reach Lena's thrashing form before the river claimed another victim. His lungs burned with a desperate need for air, but he forced himself deeper into the dark water, where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. His fingers closed around her wrist just as she went under, for what would have been the final time, her struggles growing weaker as the cold began to steal consciousness from her young body. Breaking the surface was like being reborn into a world of pain and impossible cold. Clara was leaning over the platform's edge, the guide pole thrust toward them with strength, born of desperation and love that refused to accept defeat. Here, she shouted, her voice cracking with strain and fear. Grab hold and don't let go. He caught the wooden shaft one-handed, while keeping Lena's head above water with the other, fighting the current's attempt to drag them both downstream toward the rapids that would crush their bodies against the rocks. Clara hauled them back toward the platform with muscles that felt like they might tear apart from the effort, her face twisted with exertion and terror for the people she had come to love. They collapsed onto the platform in a tangle of soaked clothing and chattering teeth, their bodies pressed together for warmth, while the ferry continued its journey toward the far bank. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Clara and Akasheta stared at each other, her eyes wide with relief and something deeper that made her heart race, his dark and steady despite the cold that was already stealing feeling from his extremities. Her hand found his cheek fingers gentle against skin that was turning blue from cold and exposure. Thank you. She whispered the words, carrying more weight than mere gratitude. I can't. I won't lose you too. The confession slipped out before she could stop it, revealing feelings that had been growing since that first night in Cinder Bluff, when he had risked everything for strangers. The current swept them to the far bank, just as Bill's men found a ford upstream, their curses and threats following across the water, like the voices of demons cheated of their prey. They had bought precious time and something more valuable, a moment of truth that acknowledged the bond growing between them, despite the differences in their backgrounds and the dangers that surrounded them on all sides. The journey to Iron Ridge became an ordeal that tested their endurance and strengthened their resolve with each passing mile. The 70 miles of unforgiving terrain stretched before them like an endless sentence of suffering. But they pressed forward with grim determination that spoke of people who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. On the second night, as a fresh blizzard threatened to bury them alive, they took shelter in a shallow cave that Akacheta discovered among the rocky outcroppings of Devil's Canyon. The space was barely large enough for the three of them and the mule, but it offered protection from the wind that had begun to howl with renewed fury. Clara shared the last of their hardtack, while Lena tended a small fire, built from scraps of deadwood that had somehow survived the moisture. The flames danced against the cave walls, casting their shadows in strange patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. "Tell me about the debt," Clara said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. "The one you mentioned that first night." Akacheta was silent for so long that she thought he hadn't heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that had been carefully preserved despite the passage of years. 3 winters passed. He began, his dark eyes focused on the fire as if reading the flames like sacred text. Sickness came to our winter camp. Bad sickness that killed the old ones and the children first. My grandmother, my sister's baby son, the fever, took them both before the moon changed. Clara felt her throat tighten with understanding. She had heard stories of the diseases that swept through Indian camps, carried by traders and soldiers who possessed immunity that the native peoples lacked. Your parents came when Dr. Walter brought word of our suffering. Akacheta continued. They had medicine, white man's medicine, that could fight the fever. Your mother, she sat with my grandmother through 2 nights, cooling her brow with wet cloth and making her drink willow bark tea even when she fought against it. The warrior's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Your father, he knew about water. Clean water, safe water. He showed us how to dig a new well upstream from the sickness, how to boil what we drank until the danger passed. They asked for nothing in return, expected no payment or favor. They came because it was right, because suffering calls to those who would answer. Clara felt tears threaten to spill from her eyes as she imagined her parents young and idealistic, risking their own lives to help strangers in a land that offered little mercy to good intentions. When I saw you in that street, kneeling in the mud with death reaching for you, I knew the debt had come due. Akacheta said simply. Your parents' kindness had found its way back across the years, demanding payment in the only currency that mattered. Honor, Clara whispered, understanding flooding through her like warm light. Honor, he confirmed, meeting her gaze across the dancing flames. And something more, though I did not recognize it at first. The words hung between them, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to voice completely. But Clara felt her heart begin to race as she realized what he was suggesting, that what had begun as obligation had transformed into something far more personal and precious. She reached across the small space that separated them, her fingers finding his where they rested on his knee. I'm glad, she said softly. Whatever brought you to us that night, I'm grateful beyond words that you came. His hand turned palm up, capturing her fingers in a gentle grip that spoke of strength carefully controlled. The debt is paid. he said quietly. What I do now, I do by choice. Outside the cave, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountain. But inside their small sanctuary, three people who had become family despite the differences in their blood and background shared warmth and hope that no storm could extinguish. Meanwhile, in the luxurious office that occupied the top floor of the Quicksilver Mining Company's headquarters building, Reginald Kingsley stood before a massive map of the territory that covered an entire wall. The chart was marked with colored pins and lines that represented his expanding empire. Red for properties already acquired, blue for water rights secured through legal and illegal means, black for the sacred lands he intended to claim through the forged treaty documents. Kingsley was a soft man whose pale hands had never known honest labor, but his mind was sharp as any blade ever forged. He had built his fortune through careful calculation and selective violence, eliminating obstacles with the same cold efficiency that he applied to extracting ore from the mountainside. 20 years, he murmured to himself, his fingers tracing the boundaries of what would soon be his exclusive domain. 20 years of planning, of positioning myself for this moment, when the old ways give ground to progress and profit. The mine owner's vision extended far beyond simple wealth accumulation. He saw himself as the architect of civilization's advance into the wilderness, the man who would transform a savage land into an engine of prosperity that would generate profits for generations to come. The fact that his empire would be built on the bones of displaced tribes and murdered settlers was merely the price of progress, a cost that history would forget in its rush to celebrate his achievements. The water is the key. He continued, his voice carrying the fervor of a man possessed by grand ambitions. Control the water and you control everything else. Ranchers, farmers, settlements, mines, all of them will dance to my tune when I hold their very survival in my hands. A soft knock at the door interrupted his soliloquy. Come, he called out, not turning from his contemplation of the map. Deputy Marcus Percival entered with the nervous gait of a man who lived in constant fear of discovery. His badge gleamed dully in the lamplight, a symbol of authority that felt like lead weight against his chest, rather than a mark of honor. The federal agent has arrived. Percival reported, his voice carefully controlled despite the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach like acid. Marshal Solomon's with him, along with a company of territorial militia. They're asking questions about water rights and mining claims. Kingsley turned from the map, his pale eyes studying his illegitimate son, with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. The family resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The same weak chin, the same nervous habit of running fingers through thinning hair when under pressure. And what have you told them? Kingsley asked, his voice carrying just enough menace to remind Percival of the consequences of betrayal. Nothing yet, the deputy replied quickly. But they've got paperwork, official documents. This isn't just some territorial investigation. This has the smell of federal authority behind it. Kingsley nodded slowly, his mind already calculating responses to this new threat. He had anticipated that his activities would eventually attract official attention, but he had expected to have more time to consolidate his position before facing serious scrutiny. Very well, he said finally. It seems our timetable has been accelerated. Send word to Sam and his men. I want those sisters found and eliminated before they can reach Iron Ridge with whatever evidence they're carrying. And Marcus? Percival looked up at the use of his given name, a familiarity that his father rarely allowed himself. Remember where your loyalties lie. Kingsley said softly. Remember what happens to those who disappoint me. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, carrying with it the weight of 23 years of manipulation and control. Percival nodded stiffly, and left the office, his heart hammering with the knowledge that the end was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Outside in the street, he paused beneath a lamp-post and allowed himself a moment of weakness. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, and his eyes darted nervously toward the shadows, where any number of threats might be lurking. For the first time in years, Deputy Marcus Percival found himself wondering if there might be another way, a path that led away from his father's empire of corruption and towards something that resembled redemption. But such thoughts were dangerous luxuries that could get a man killed. And he had survived this long by keeping his head down and following orders. Still, as he walked back toward the jail where federal investigators waited with their uncomfortable questions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the day of reckoning was finally at hand. The abandoned schoolhouse at Sable Junction stood like a gravestone marking the death of dreams and the failure of civilization to take root in hostile soil. Built during the homestead boom when optimism ran higher than common sense, it had served 24 families before drought and failed crops drove most of them back east or into early graves. Now it offered shelter only to those desperate enough to ignore the stories of what had happened to the last teacher who had tried to bring learning to this corner of hell. Abigail Thornton waited in the doorway, like an angel of mercy, her schoolteacher's composure cracking as she saw the sisters alive and whole, despite everything that had been arrayed against them. A woman of 35 who had chosen education over marriage and regretted the decision exactly never. She possessed the quiet strength that frontier communities demanded of their leaders and the compassion that made her beloved by children who might otherwise never learn to read. "Dear sweet Lord in heaven," she breathed, pulling Lena into an embrace fierce enough to crack ribs. "When Dr. Walter's message came through on the telegraph, I feared you'd been taken or worse." She led them into the main classroom, where student desks had been pushed aside to make room for bedrolls and supplies that spoke of careful preparation and genuine care. A pot-bellied stove radiated blessed warmth that seemed to penetrate frozen bones and restore feeling to extremities that had been numb for hours. The aroma of real coffee filled the air, not the chicory substitute or roasted grain that had become their usual fare, but actual coffee beans that must have cost a small fortune to obtain. Food in the root cellar and clean clothes that should fit well enough, Abigail said with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Rest while I wire Iron Ridge about the federal agent's arrival. There are arrangements that need to be made if we're going to see justice done properly." Clara sank onto one of the bedrolls with gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Beside her, Lena curled up with the boneless grace of youth, her breathing already deepening toward the sleep that had been denied them for too many nights running. Only Akacheta remained alert, his warrior's instincts keeping watch even in apparent sanctuary, because he understood that safety was always temporary, and death could strike without warning. "You saved them both," Abigail told him quietly, her voice carrying admiration and respect that crossed cultural boundaries. "Their parents would be proud of what you've done, and grateful beyond words for the honor you've shown their daughters." The Lakota warrior acknowledged her words with a slight nod, but his thoughts remained on the cave where Clara had touched his hand and spoken of choices that went beyond mere duty. The memory warmed him more than any fire could, filling spaces in his heart that he had not realized were empty until they began to heal. "There's something else you need to know." Abigail continued, lowering her voice so the exhausted sisters wouldn't overhear. "Word came from the territorial capital last week, through official channels. The federal government's planning new treaty negotiations with all the western tribes. Land rights throughout the territory are going to be reconsidered and possibly redistributed according to new priorities." Akacheta's expression hardened with the knowledge that came from bitter experience. He had heard such promises before, and they invariably ended with his people confined to smaller reservations while their sacred lands were parceled out to miners and settlers who saw only profit where others saw the dwelling places of spirits and ancestors. My brother-in-law Will runs the saloon here in town. She added, changing the subject with the delicacy of someone who understood that some wounds were too fresh to examine closely. He's been nervous lately, tax troubles and debt collectors making threats. But he's fundamentally decent, and he'll help if we need supplies or information. They had rested for barely 2 hours when Tokola slipped through the back door like smoke, giving form his young face tight with urgency that spoke of immediate danger approaching from multiple directions. 7 riders approached from the east. He reported in Lakota before switching to English for the others' benefit. The cruel one with the wire scars leads them, and they ride like men who know exactly where they're going. They will arrive within the hour. Akacheta rose instantly, moving to peer through gaps in the boarded windows that had been installed to keep out winter wind and summer heat alike. In the distance, he could see the approaching horsemen, their mounts throwing up small clouds of snow as they followed the trail toward the schoolhouse, with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. Betrayal. He said simply the word, carrying more weight than longer speeches about the nature of treachery and the price of trust misplaced. The betrayal came from the most unexpected and heartbreaking source imaginable. Quiet Will McKenna had overheard Abigail's telegraph conversation with Dr. Walter the previous day, learning about the medical supplies being requested for the fugitive sisters who had become the territory's most wanted criminals. Fear had been eating away at Will's courage like acid for months, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who saw threats in every shadow and creditors behind every corner. When Barbed Wire Bill rode into Sable Junction, asking questions with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having those questions answered immediately and completely, Will's resolve crumbled like a dam made of sand. He traded information for promises of protection from the debt collectors who haunted his nightmares, hoping that cooperation would buy him safety and peace of mind. Now, watching the gunmen approach the building where innocent people had taken shelter, shame burned in his chest like molten lead, while his hands shook with the magnitude of what he had done. There would be no peace, he realized with crystal clarity, because some betrayals were too great to be forgiven by God or man. At the schoolhouse, Akacheta was already formulating escape plans with the tactical precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare against impossible odds. The building offered 2 exits, front and rear doors, separated by 100 yards of open ground that offered no concealment from rifles. The only cover lay in a weathered fence that marked the boundary of what had once been the school's playground, where children had laughed and played games that seemed impossibly innocent in retrospect. When I give the signal, he told Clara, his voice carrying the authority of a war chief planning battle. Run for that fence and don't stop or look back. Follow Tokala. He knows these prairies better than any map ever drawn and can guide you to safety if I fall. Clara nodded, her jaw set with the determination that had carried her through months of hardship and loss. She had rewrapped the surveyor's page in oilcloth, once again securing it inside her dress where it would survive, even if they had to swim another river or crawl through mud to escape their pursuers. The riders were close enough now to hear Bill's voice issuing orders with the precision of a military commander deploying troops for battle. The foreman had learned hard lessons from their previous encounters, and he was spreading his men in a wide circle to prevent any possibility of escape through superior knowledge of the terrain. Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt. Bill shouted, though his tone suggested that hurt was exactly what he had in mind, regardless of their response. Mr. Kingsley just wants to have a civilized conversation about certain property that belongs to him. Akacheta's answer was the crash of window glass as he used his rifle butt to clear a firing position, the sound echoing across the prairie like a gunshot. The noise announced their refusal to surrender and their willingness to die fighting rather than submit to whatever tortures Kingsley had planned for them. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a prairie thunderstorm, bullets punching through the schoolhouse's thin walls and sending splinters flying like wooden shrapnel that drew blood from exposed skin. The pot-bellied stove rang like a bell as ricochets struck its iron surface, and the smell of black powder began to overpower the coffee's homey aroma. Clara had claimed a rifle that Abigail kept for protection against wolves and claimed jumpers, putting her hard-earned marksmanship to deadly use. Her first shot went wide as nerves affected her aim, but her second caught one of Bill's men in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a scream of pain and outrage that carried clearly across the battlefield. The engagement settled into a deadly rhythm, brief exchanges of gunfire punctuated by tense silences as both sides sought better positions and tried to anticipate their opponent's next moves. Abigail pressed herself against the floor, helping Lena stay low, while bullets whined overhead like angry wasps seeking targets for their lethal stings. The firefight had raged for perhaps 30 minutes, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage when disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. One of Bill's men had worked his way close enough to the building to hurl a torch onto the schoolhouse roof, and flames began eating through the dry shingles with the hungry efficiency of a living thing that fed on destruction. "Fire on the roof!" Lena screamed, pointing upward, as smoke began seeping through the ceiling in gray tendrils that spoke of worse to come. The temperature inside the building rose rapidly as flames spread across the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Smoke thickened the air until every breath became a struggle, while the crackle of burning wood provided sinister counterpoint to the ongoing gunfight that showed no signs of ending. "They mean to roast us alive like Christmas geese," Akasheta observed, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of a warrior who had always known he would die in battle. Clara scanned the single room that had become their fortress, searching desperately for options that seemed not to exist. The front door remained covered by at least 3 rifles, and the rear exit was blocked by more gunmen, and now fire was consuming their shelter from above, while smoke made it increasingly difficult to see or breathe. That was when she remembered her father's stories about the homestead boom, when settlers had built quickly and cheaply, often incorporating existing foundations and root cellars to save time and materials that were always in short supply. "What's there?" she said, pointing to a section of floor near the rear wall where the planking looked different from the rest. "Root cellar underneath. Papa said they all had them for storing supplies during the winter months." Akacheta was already moving with fluid grace, using his rifle butt to smash through the rough planking that covered what lay beneath. The wood splintered and broke away to reveal exactly what Clara had hoped for: a shallow excavation that had once stored potatoes and preserves during the harsh winter months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. The space was barely large enough for 4 people, but it represented their only chance of survival. As burning timbers began crashing down from the collapsing roof, they dropped through the opening just as a section of the ceiling gave way, entirely filling the air with sparks and choking smoke that would have killed them within minutes. The root cellar extended beyond the building's foundation, emerging in a tangle of brush and deadfall that provided momentary concealment from their enemies. But their escape had not gone unnoticed. Bill's men were already converging on their position, their shouts mixing with the roar of flames as the schoolhouse became a funeral pyre that could be seen for miles across the prairie. Forest line. Akacheta commanded, pushing Clara and Lena ahead of him into the maze of pine and scrub oak that crowned the nearby ridge. "Don't stop running until you reach Iron Ridge, and don't look back no matter what you hear behind you." But Clara had no intention of abandoning the man who had risked everything for them, the warrior who had become something far more precious than an ally in their fight for justice. Instead of fleeing toward distant safety, She grabbed his arm with strength born of desperation and pulled him with her into the wilderness. "Together," she said fiercely, her eyes blazing with determination that would brook no argument. "All of us or none of us. That's how this ends." The pursuit through the forest became a nightmare of shadows and muzzle flashes with bullets whining past their ears and bark exploding from trees around them in showers of splinters. Bill's men spread out to prevent flanking maneuvers, driving their quarry always upward toward the barren peaks, where shelter would be impossible to find, and the cold would finish what gunfire had started. But they had underestimated both Akacheta's wilderness skills and the desperation of people fighting not just for their lives, but for the chance to see justice done at last. The warrior led them along game trails that were invisible to untrained eyes, through narrow defiles, and across rocky ledges that would have challenged mountain goats in their sure-footed navigation of treacherous terrain. It was during one of these hair-raising crossings that near disaster struck with the suddenness of an avalanche. Lena's foot slipped on ice-covered stone, and she went sliding toward a precipice that dropped into black emptiness, where death waited with patient certainty. Akacheta lunged forward with reflexes honed by years of combat, catching her wrist just as she went over the edge. But her weight threatened to drag them both into the abyss that would claim all their lives. Clara threw herself flat on the rocks without regard for her own safety, adding her strength to his as they slowly pulled her sister back from the brink of eternity. For long moments, they lay gasping on the narrow ledge, hearts hammering with reaction and residual terror, while the wind howled around them like the voices of the damned. It was then that Bill's voice echoed from the canyon below, carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "Got you cornered now, like rats in a barn," he shouted with obvious satisfaction. "Nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Time to pay the piper for all the trouble you've caused." The foreman had found their trail at last, and he was climbing toward their position with the grim patience of a predator that knew its prey was trapped and helpless. Behind him, 3 surviving gunmen struggled up the rocky slope, their rifles ready for the final confrontation that would end this chase once and for all. "End of the trail," Akacheta said quietly, checking his remaining ammunition with the methodical care of a professional soldier. Perhaps 3 cartridges remained in his Spencer, not enough for a prolonged fight against determined enemies who had them outnumbered and outgunned. But Clara was studying the terrain above them with her father's trained eye, seeing possibilities that might escape a less educated observer who hadn't spent years learning to read the land and understand its hidden strengths. "At that ledge," she said, pointing to an overhanging shelf of rock that looked unstable even to untrained eyes. "Papa taught me to recognize dangerous formations when we went surveying together. If we could bring it down somehow." Akacheta followed her gaze and understood immediately what she was suggesting. The ledge was held in place by little more than gravity, and the pressure of accumulated ice poised like a weapon, waiting to be triggered by someone with enough knowledge and desperation to attempt something that bordered on suicide. Dangerous beyond measure. He warned, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. If it goes wrong, we all die together in the rubble. We're dead anyway if we stay here and let them pick us off like sitting ducks. Clara replied, already moving toward the precarious formation, with careful steps that tested each foothold before committing her full weight. Together, they put their shoulders against the base of the overhanging rock and pushed with every ounce of strength they possessed, and their muscles straining against stone that seemed as immovable as the mountain itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Clara feared they had misjudged the situation entirely. Then, with a grinding rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, the ledge broke free from its ancient resting place. The rockfall that followed was both terrible and magnificent, to behold a cascade of stone and ice that gathered momentum as it descended toward the men climbing below. Bill's scream was cut short as the avalanche claimed him, and his surviving gunmen erasing the immediate threat in seconds, while the mountain itself served as judge and executioner. But victory came at a terrible price that became apparent only as the dust settled. The rockfall had blocked their road of ascent, trapping them on a narrow shelf with no apparent way down from their rocky prison. They had eliminated their pursuers, but condemned themselves to death by exposure on a mountain that showed no mercy to the stranded. "Now what do we do?" Lena asked, her voice small and frightened in the sudden silence that followed the destruction below. That was when they heard new sounds rising from the canyon. Not the scattered rhythm of pursuit, but the organized cadence of a large party moving with military precision and purpose that spoke of federal authority rather than local corruption. United States Marshal, a voice called upward, carrying the unmistakable ring of official power that could not be bought or intimidated. "Show yourselves if you're up there, we're here to help." Clara felt hope kindle in her chest, like a struck match, bright and warm, against the cold despair that had threatened to overwhelm her. Don't ask. Walter had reached Iron Ridge after all, and he had brought the one man in the territory who possessed both the authority and the integrity to see justice done properly. "Here!" she shouted, waving her arms frantically to make herself visible against the gray stone. "We're trapped up here, 3 of us still alive." Marshal Ezra Solomon proved to be a small, wiry man whose steel-gray hair and winter-pale eyes spoke of decades spent bringing law to lawless places where justice was often a luxury that few could afford. He directed the rescue operation with quiet competence that inspired confidence, using ropes and climbing equipment to reach the stranded trio and bring them safely down to the canyon floor below. Dr. Walter filled me in on the situation. Solomon explained as they warmed themselves around a hastily built fire that seemed like a miracle after their ordeal on the mountain. "Seems Mr. Kingsley's been keeping himself busy with activities that violate both territorial and federal law. Judge Harrison Blackwood is riding down from Denver to sort this mess out according to proper legal procedures." "What about the corrupt agent?" Clara asked, clutching the surveyor's page that had survived everything they had endured. "Chandler." Solomon's smile held no warmth whatsoever, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered dangerous prey. "Found him in a whorehouse in Iron Ridge, drunk as a lord, and bragging about the fortune he was going to make from this operation. He's sobering up in my jail right now, and I expect he'll be very eager to cooperate with federal authorities once he realizes the magnitude of the charges he's facing." The marshal's expression grew more serious as he examined the water theft documentation that had cost so many lives to protect and preserve. His weathered hands handled the paper with the reverence due to evidence that could topple an empire built on corruption and murder. "This is damning evidence of the highest order," he said after studying the careful measurements and notations. "Water theft, conspiracy, murder, corruption of federal officials. Kingsley's looking at a hemp necktie, assuming Judge Blackwood is feeling merciful when the time comes for sentencing." But even as relief flooded through Clara's exhausted mind, she noticed something that made her blood run cold despite the fire's warmth. One of the marshal's deputies, a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly, kept glancing toward the canyon rim as if expecting someone or something to appear. When he thought no one was watching, he made subtle hand signals toward the heights above, gestures that spoke of prior arrangement and treachery that ran deeper than anyone had suspected. Clara felt her heart sink as she realized that Kingsley's corruption had infected even this federal operation. The attack, when it came, struck with the speed and violence of a rattlesnake emerging from concealment. "Marshal Solomon!" The shout came from multiple directions simultaneously, as armed men rose from positions among the rocks like demons emerging from hell itself. "Drop your weapons immediately. You're completely surrounded." But this time, the ambush didn't unfold according to Kingsley's carefully laid plans. The mine owner appeared on a ledge above them with his hired guns, but his confident expression faltered as he realized that Solomon's men weren't surrendering as expected. Instead, they were taking cover and returning fire with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers. "You're too late, Kingsley." Solomon called out, his voice carrying clearly through the echoing gunfire. "Your boy Percival already told us about the ambush. We've been expecting you." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. The nervous deputy's signals hadn't been treachery. They had been warnings carefully coordinated with Solomon to draw Kingsley into a trap of their own making. The corruption they had feared was actually an elaborate deception designed to catch the mine owner in the act of murder and conspiracy. But Kingsley's men were numerous and well-positioned, and what should have been a simple arrest turned into a pitched battle that raged across the canyon floor. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, while men on both sides fell wounded or dead. It became clear within minutes that Solomon's forces were pinned down, unable to advance against the superior position that Kingsley had chosen for his final stand. The marshal had anticipated treachery, but he hadn't expected the mine owner to bring so many men or to choose such defensible ground for the confrontation. That was when Clara realized that their survival and the cause of justice itself depended not on federal authority or military precision, but on the skills and courage of individuals who were willing to risk everything for what was right. "The rock formation above Kingsley's position," she said urgently to Akacheta, pointing to a section of the canyon wall that looked suspiciously familiar. "Papa taught me to recognize unstable geological structures. That overhang won't support much weight, and there are stress fractures running all through the base." The warrior studied the formation with tactical eyes, seeing immediately what she was suggesting. If they could reach a position above and behind Kingsley's men, they might be able to create another controlled rockfall, not to kill, but to cut off the mine owner's escape route and force his surrender. "Dangerous," he said simply, but his tone suggested acceptance rather than refusal. "Everything we've done has been dangerous." Clara replied, already checking her rifle to ensure it was loaded and ready. "But this is our chance to end it once and for all." What followed was a demonstration of skill and courage that would have impressed even the most experienced military tacticians. While Solomon's men kept up a steady rate of fire to distract Kingsley's attention, Akacheta and Clara began a flanking maneuver that took them high up the canyon wall through terrain that would have challenged mountain goats. The Lakota warrior moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to such country, finding handholds and footholds where none seemed to exist. Clara followed his lead, drawing on memories of surveying expeditions with her father when she had learned to read the land and understand its hidden strengths and weaknesses. Lena remained with Solomon and his men, but she was far from passive in her contribution to the battle. Using knowledge inherited from her mother's healing practice, she moved among the wounded with strips of cloth torn from her dress-binding wounds, and offering what comfort she could to men who had risked their lives for justice. The climb took nearly an hour, with bullets occasionally whining past, as Kingsley's men spotted movement on the canyon walls. But Akacheta's knowledge of concealment and Clara's understanding of geology combined to bring them to exactly the position they needed, directly above the unstable rock formation that sheltered their enemies. Working together with tools improvised from fallen branches and loose stones, they began the delicate process of creating a controlled landslide. The key was precision rather than brute force, applying pressure at exactly the right points to trigger a collapse that would block escape routes without crushing the men they sought to capture alive. "Now," Clara whispered, and together they gave the final push, that sent tons of rock cascading down the canyon wall. The landslide was smaller than the one that had eliminated Barbed Wire Bill, but it was precisely placed to achieve maximum tactical effect. Boulders crashed down around Kingsley's position, cutting off his escape routes and filling the air with dust that made accurate shooting impossible. When the dust settled, the mine owner found himself trapped in a small pocket of space with nowhere to run, and federal marshals closing in from all sides. His hired guns, seeing their employer's position was hopeless, began throwing down their weapons and calling for mercy. But Kingsley himself was not finished yet. Drawing a hideout gun from his coat with desperate speed, he pointed the small derringer at Lena's head, where she knelt tending a wounded deputy. "Stand back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as his empire collapsed around him. "I'll kill her. I swear on my mother's grave, I'll put a bullet in her brain." The threat froze everyone in place, federal marshals and hired guns alike, recognizing that the situation had suddenly become far more dangerous than any amount of gunfire. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and an innocent girl would die for the crimes of men who had never given her a moment's thought. But Akacheta was already in motion, using the chaos and confusion to work his way closer to Kingsley's position. The warrior moved like smoke, given form invisible, until the moment he struck with the speed and precision of a hunting cat. The struggle was brief, but vicious, the derringer discharging harmlessly into the air while the two men grappled in the dust and stones. Within seconds, the mine owner found himself face down in the dirt, with the Lakota warrior's knee pressed firmly against his spine, and his dreams of empire reduced to ashes and failure. "Moms, it's finished," Solomon announced with deep satisfaction, producing iron shackles from his saddlebags, like a magician revealing his final trick. "Reginald Kingsley, you're under arrest for conspiracy murder, theft of federal resources, and conspiracy murder bribery of federal officers, theft of federal water forgery of surveys and deeds, and obstruction of justice of America." The trial that followed became the talk of the territory, conducted in Iron Ridge's courthouse, under the stern gaze of federal Judge Harrison Blackwood, whose reputation for integrity stretched from Denver to San Francisco and beyond. The elderly jurist had earned his position through decades of fearless service, and his white beard and piercing blue eyes gave him the appearance of divine justice made manifest in human form. The evidence against Kingsley was overwhelming and irrefutable. Clara's father's surveyor page provided mathematical proof of the illegal water diversions, while testimony from Dr. Walter Hugh Morrison and dozens of other witnesses painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into every level of territorial government like a cancer. Kingsley sat in the defendant's chair with a shell-shocked expression of a man whose world had collapsed around him, his expensive lawyers reduced to pleading for mercy as witness after witness detailed his crimes with devastating precision. The mine owner's empire of corruption was being dismantled piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop the process. The most damning testimony came from Chandler, the corrupt federal agent, who had been promised a fortune in exchange for legitimizing Kingsley's land grabs through forged documents and false reports. Faced with charges of conspiracy murder bribery of federal officers, theft of federal water forgery of surveys and deeds, and obstruction of justice that could result in hanging, he cooperated fully with prosecutors, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the territorial justice system. But it was Clara herself who delivered the killing blow to Kingsley's defense. Standing before the packed courtroom with quiet dignity, she read aloud from her father's careful notes, her voice clear and strong, as she detailed each theft and murder with the precision of a trained surveyor. The precious page passed from hand to hand among the jurors, its precise measurements leaving no room for doubt about the defendant's guilt. This document, she concluded, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, represents my father's dedication to truth and justice. He died because he refused to let these crimes go unpunished, and I will not dishonor his memory by accepting anything less than complete accountability for every life that was lost. But it was during the third day of testimony that the most shocking revelation emerged, delivered by a witness whose appearance in the courtroom sent ripples of amazement through the packed gallery. Deputy Marcus Percival, the man they had all assumed was another corrupt lawman in Kingsley's employ, instead stood before the judge with tears streaming down his weathered face, and a confession that changed everything the court thought it knew about the case. "Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that had been suppressed for over 2 decades. "I have something to say that's been eating at my soul like acid for 23 years. Reginald Kingsley, he's my father." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps of disbelief as the full implications of this revelation became clear. Judge Blackwood gavelled for order, while lawyers on both sides scrambled to understand how this changed their cases and what it meant for the outcome of the trial. "I was born out of wedlock to a Crow woman he used and abandoned when she became inconvenient." Percival continued his confession, pouring out like water from a broken dam. "He never acknowledged me, never claimed me as his son. But he used that blood connection to control me and force me to do his bidding for decades." The deputy's hands shook as he detailed years of corruption and violence carried out at his father's command crimes that had weighed on his conscience until he could no longer bear the burden of secrecy and shame that had defined his entire adult life. Every forged deed, every intimidated witness, every accident that befell honest folks who got in his way. I helped make it happen because he promised someday he'd claim me as his son and give me a place in his empire. But that day never came, and it never would have come, because to him I was just another tool to be used and discarded when I was no longer useful. The confession provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure Kingsley's conviction on all counts, while simultaneously explaining the nervous behavior that had made Clara suspicious during the canyon confrontation. Percival had been torn between loyalty to his father and duty to the law, ultimately choosing justice over blood when forced to make the final decision. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a unanimous verdict of guilty on charges of murder, conspiracy theft of federal resources, and conspiracy murder bribery of federal officers, theft of federal water forgery of surveys and deeds, and obstruction of justice. Judge Blackwood's sentence was swift and merciless. "Reginald Kingsley, you have been found guilty of crimes against both the territory and the United States government that shock the conscience and violate every principle of civilized society. You are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, with the execution to be carried out within 30 days of this judgment." But perhaps more importantly for the future of the territory, the judge voided all of Kingsley's fraudulent land claims and returned the stolen property to its rightful owners. The sacred sites that had been threatened were placed under federal protection, ensuring they would remain inviolate for future generations who would never know how close they had come to losing their heritage forever. Water rights were restored to their legal owners, allowing farmers and ranchers to rebuild their lives after years of drought and theft. The Quicksilver mine was placed under federal receivership, its profits to be used for compensation and restoration rather than personal enrichment. As spring returned to the valley of Willow Gap, with the promise of new beginnings, Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin she and Akacheta were building together on land that had been legally granted to her mother years earlier. The legal discovery of her mother's land grant among Kingsley's papers had been the final surprise in a case full of revelations, a genuine deed that provided them with claim to some of the finest bottomland in the territory, along with water rights that could never be disputed or stolen. The structure they were creating represented a fusion of two cultures, part frontier homestead with its solid log walls and stone chimney, part Lakota lodge with its careful attention to the relationship between shelter and the natural world. It was a testament to the unlikely love that had grown from shared danger and mutual respect, strengthened by trials that would have destroyed weaker bonds. Lena emerged from the vegetable garden she had been cultivating with the dedicated enthusiasm of someone who had known real hunger, her hands rich with dark soil, and her face bright with the satisfaction that came from honest work. At 18, she had grown into a confident young woman who bore little resemblance to the frightened child who had cowered in Cinder Bluff's frozen streets. "Corn's looking fine," she reported with pride in her accomplishment. "Should have enough for winter storage with plenty left over for trading with the neighbors who are starting to move back now that the water's flowing again." The garden itself was another symbol of their partnership, combining traditional farming techniques with native plant knowledge that Akacheta had shared from his people's centuries of experience with the land. Wild turnips grew beside domestic onions, and prairie sage shared space with imported herbs that had been carefully nurtured through the harsh winter months. Akacheta appeared from the creek, where he had been checking fish traps, his movements as graceful and purposeful as ever, despite the months of peace that had followed their ordeal. The time of safety had not softened him, but it had given him something he had never expected: to find a home worth defending and a family worth dying for, if necessity demanded such sacrifice. "Water runs clear and cold as mountain springs," he announced, settling beside Clara on the cabin's front step that commanded a view of the entire valley. "The fish have returned in numbers I haven't seen since my grandfather's time, now that Kingsley's poison no longer flows downstream to kill everything in its path." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson, while meadowlarks called to their mates across the prairie grass that waved in the evening breeze. The marriage ceremony had taken place in late spring, with Judge Blackwood himself performing the service, and Marshal Solomon standing as witness to their union. It had been a simple affair conducted beneath the cottonwoods beside Willow Gap Creek, with guests that included Dr. Walter Hugh Morrison, Abigail Thornton, and a delegation from Akacheta's band who had ridden south to meet their kinsman's new wife and judge her worthiness for themselves. Even Deputy Percival had attended, seeking redemption through service to the community he had helped damage. The legal complications had proved surprisingly manageable in a territory where survival often mattered more than social conventions. Their union was recognized by both federal and territorial law, and the land deed remained valid regardless of Clara's change in status from unmarried woman to wife of a Lakota warrior. More importantly, the local community had accepted their arrangement with the pragmatic tolerance that frontier life demanded. When survival depended on cooperation and mutual aid, personal prejudices became luxuries that few could afford. "Any regrets about the path we've chosen?" Akacheta asked quietly, echoing his question from that first desperate night in Cinder Bluff, when their lives had been hanging by threads. Clara looked at her husband, for that was what he was now in every sense that mattered, and felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person at exactly the right moment in history. "None whatsoever," she said with complete certainty. "This is home, and you are family, and together we've built something that will last long after we're gone." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, while the first stars appeared in the darkening sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The harsh land that had nearly claimed their lives had become their sanctuary, a place where two very different worlds could meet and create something entirely new and beautiful. As Clara leaned against Akacheta's shoulder and felt his arm tighten around her waist, she knew with absolute certainty that their long journey was complete. They had found justice for her parents, saved sacred lands from desecration, exposed corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government, and discovered love in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. The debt of honor that had brought them together had been paid in full, but the bonds they had forged would endure forever. In a territory that devoured the weak and unwary, they had not merely survived. They had built something beautiful and lasting that would serve as an example for future generations trying to find their way in a changing world. The ledger was balanced at last, and their story had found its perfect ending in the promise of new beginnings that stretched as far as the horizon itself, bright with possibility and hope.